Hi, and welcome to episode 262 of the Untethered podcast. Today we have Jessie Ginsburg joining us. Jessie is a sensory-trained speech-language pathologist and CEO of Pediatric Therapy Playhouse, a top-rated clinic in Los Angeles, California. She's an international speaker, creator of the Global Inside Out Sensory Communication Programs, and author of Ready, Set, Connect, a sensory-based approach to accelerate communication in autistic children. Quick disclaimer, all information, content, and material of this podcast are the opinions of the speakers and is for the informational purpose only and not intended to serve as a substitute for the consultation, diagnosis, and/or medical treatment of a qualified healthcare provider. Welcome to the Untethered podcast. I am your host, Hallie Bulkin. I'm a certified myofunctional therapist, feeding specialist, podcaster, business owner, and mentor. This podcast is all about getting your questions answered and collaborating with colleagues to bring you the most up-to-date information in the orofacial myofunctional therapy, airway, tethered oral tissue, and pediatric feeding therapy space. If you're new here, I challenge you to keep an open mind and join my mission to spread this message far and wide. If you've been around since June 2019, thanks for being a loyal listener. As we jump into today's episode, remember to listen with correct oral rest posture. Tongue up, lips closed, teeth apart, breathe through your nose. Let's get started. Jessie, welcome to the podcast.
Oh my gosh, so excited to be here. This is very exciting.
I know. I feel like we have all kinds of conversations outside of recording, so we might as well get on here and record a podcast together, especially because I know you've got some big things happening. You got a book coming out soon. And I know we'll dive into that a bit today, but we also have Autism Awareness Month going on and some other fun things we're going to talk about. But before we dive into all that stuff, one of the biggest burning questions, and I know I mentioned this before we recorded, but one of the biggest things that I have for you, and it's probably the only question, honestly, that I have, aside from what's going to naturally, roll out of my mouth while we're talking, is how do you address when people go, hey, I didn't know SLPs do sensory. I didn't know that the sensory system is something that speech pathologists address. Isn't that the OT's domain? Can you talk a little bit about that? Because you are the sensory ASD queen in the SLP world.
Thank you, first of all. And it is usually a meaner version of that question. So that was a very nice way to ask that question. Usually it's you shouldn't be doing that, or,
Cool.
That's not within your scope, all of that, which is why it's one of my favorite things to talk about, is why sensory is in the scope of the SLP. And I feel like talking about it wasn't enough. I had to go out, publish ASHA articles on it. I even reached out to Dr. Winnie Dunn, who is the world-renowned OT who created the sensory profile, probably the most commonly used sensory assessment out there. And I consulted with her when I was creating my course, and I had these conversations with her, and that helped a lot too. Because I don't know, there's just something, the word, well, I guess scope creep is supposed to have a negative connotation, right? But
Right.
It just really drives me crazy because there is room for everyone at the sensory table. Sensory is a part of everyone's lives every single minute of the day. And there is not one person on this earth who shouldn't understand sensory. And, the thing is that the reason that SLPs use a sensory-based approach is very different than why, say, OTs will use a sensory-based approach. And that's because our goals are different. So in my mind, sensory is not the goal. It's the approach we're using to meet the goal. And OTs need sensory so that they can work on all these activities of daily living and all of these fine motor skills and gross motor skills that they're teaching. We need sensory so that we can help to get our kids into a regulated state so that our sessions are more effective, so that they're learning, so that 100%. We can go on to work on communication and all of the other things we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, with feeding, it's so vital that we're in a place of rest and digest, and we're not in that fight or flight. And I feel like that's the nervous system, the sensory system. It's everything has to basically come to a very calm place so that we can access what we need to in order to work towards our other goals. So I love that you kind of highlighted that because I mean, isn't it true, unless I'm totally out of touch because I'm not treating right now, but isn't it true that like sensory processing disorder, like does it still not have a diagnostic code? Like it's not a standalone diagnosis?
Correct.
Okay. So
And
that
it's
hasn't changed.
funny because I've posted this question. I just did recently, and I did about a year ago. And I asked my audience, I said, is it neurodiversity affirming? Do you feel it's neurodiversity affirming? You know, keep in mind, there's no right answer here, but do you feel like it's neurodiversity affirming to say sensory processing disorder, or should we say sensory differences? Right? Because we're thinking from the neurodiversity paradigm, the idea is that our brain is processing the world differently. So, like autistic people, for example, communicate differently, process emotions differently. So, is sensory disorder or is it a difference? And it's so funny because I asked that twice, got thousands of responses, and it was almost 50-50 both times. It was maybe like 45% said we should call it sensory processing disorder, and 55 said sensory differences.
Wow. Interesting.
It's interesting
Yeah,
because the argument for calling it sensory processing disorder is usually, you know, we need to validate the fact that this is something that's very real that can impact someone's life every single day. And if we call it sensory differences, is that being, you know, portrayed in the way that we're describing a child? And
interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's
Food for
definitely
thought.
one of those conversations that I feel like I hear a lot of it, but you know, I feel like when sensory plays into the work that I've done as far as like what I've taught, I know, and I learned early on, you can't separate the sensory system from the motor system, like in its most simplistic way of describing it, right? Like I know that everything is kind of taught in silos, and like so we typically will learn about the sensory system, we'll learn about the motor system, but like truly when you're assessing or treating a child, you're getting everything and you're kind of having to address everything. And so that's why I also, again, love your approach, because those strategies that address the sensory system are key to success. I mean, that's huge for a lot of our little ones.
Yeah, as you were just talking, I just had a flashback to this session. I had this kid come in and it was supposed to be for feeding therapy. He was almost 5. He was still on purees, and it was really interesting kid. They'd done a bunch of genetic testing. He ended up getting like multiple diagnoses, but he came in for this session where parents wanted us to work on feeding, and he was just so dysregulated, you know. And I said, well, how do you normally feed him? Well, we strap him into the chair and play the iPad and spoon feed him, you know. And I'm like, oh man, this is not gonna
Parents are in
be
survival
what they
mode.
thought that
Yeah.
this therapy was gonna be, you know.
Yeah.
I was like, we're not ready for that yet. Gotta work on getting him regulated.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's very interesting too, because as you're sharing that, I'm thinking back to just so many different cases that have come through my practice where children come, families, right? You know, caregivers, they come and it's like they've been through so much trauma surrounding feeding or even just surrounding language interventions, sometimes based on certain approaches or programs. And, you know, we get these kids and it's the exact same thing. I'm like, I've never call myself like an expert in anything sensory, but it's like, how do you as a clinician not look at a child and go like, wow, like we really kind of need to address some other things before we can even tackle those goals that they came here for, you know, whether it's feeding, language, other activities of daily living, if you're an OT or whatever, you know, it's like this kid is not ready to receive the therapy. And also like to that point, from like a gross motor standpoint, I remember like being a young clinician and taking a kid like outside on the playground to do a session. And I'd be like, why do they talk so much more when they're moving? Like what's happening that, you know, they're running around on the playground and we're getting so much more like language, like spontaneous language, but also like they're responding to me more and we're moving. We're not like doing this like focused activity. Right. And I'm like, it started just like dawn on me, like how we're so interconnected throughout our body and how all systems really need to be, like you said, like regulated in order to work towards, you know, some of our goals. So I don't know. I feel like and those were a mix of children who were autistic and children who were, you know, who weren't, who I just feel like my autistic kiddos early on were the ones who really taught me the most,
Mhm.
especially in feeding, because I used to watch them and be like, okay, they want me to work on language with this kid, and this kid's like withholding a bowel movement right now. Like, they're not available to do that. Why are we not addressing this? Like, why are we not addressing the root cause here? Or, okay, the kid is like on the floor spinning some wheels and they want me to stop that. Like, why would we stop that? Why wouldn't I just get down on the floor and kind of join them and see if they, you know, take to that? I don't know. Like, why don't I just meet them where they're at? And I feel like that was just my intuition as a new clinician. I didn't know what was right or what was wrong or what the research said or didn't say. And I didn't really care because I was like, on a human level, I just want to figure out a way to like get in and connect. And so like, I really like, I always say, I think all of those children who are autistic, because they honestly were the ones who kept me on my toes and who made me a better clinician in like stopping, not like listening to all the things I was taught and like going, okay, how do we connect? Like, the connection is most important, because once we connect, I know we can do other things. And like, honestly, they were just my most favorite like little ones early on in my career.
Yes, I feel like yes. Hands up emoji, yes, to everything you're saying. Like, I've said everything that just came out of your mouth before. And I think that that's what's so hard, is we all have these intuitive feelings that this doesn't feel good and it doesn't seem like it's working. So why are we doing it? And that's actually wasn't the first time I wrote for Asha, but it was the first time I wrote for Asha on this type of approach, where we need to really focus on these foundations of working with kids. We need to focus on regulation. We need to focus on engagement. And I wrote this article for Asha. I was terrified because I was basically saying, I don't care about language until I think about these other things. And it was just one of those things where I put my heart out on the line, and I was so scared to publish it. And like I said, I had written for Asha before, and you have your email address in there. Okay. That's a requirement when you write for them. I had written for them before. How many people had ever reached out to me? Zero. Okay. The day this article came out, I had hundreds of emails in my inbox just flooding in. And it was just everyone saying exactly what you said. It was everyone saying, I've always felt like this, but I didn't know that other people felt the same. Or like, this gives me permission that it's okay to feel this way. Now, what do I do? And that's honestly how my sensory course and my programs were born, because it was all these people saying, I agree, I want to do it differently, but how do I do that? And they just didn't know.
That was going to be my question. Like, is that when you started your online business and everything?
Yeah, that's exactly what started it. And it's funny because you said earlier, it felt like they weren't ready to work on language sometimes in those sessions. And that's exactly the premise of my book. And it's called Ready, Set, Connect, which is kind of a play on words, because, if you're a pediatric therapist, you say ready, set, go all day long. But also it's this idea that like, we can't do that until we focus on these couple of first steps. So it's like, what is ready? What is set? And then we can go on to work our magic and work on communication, learning, feeding, whatever our goals are. But we really have to strengthen regulation, engagement, make sure what we're doing is motivating for the child in order to be able to get to where we want to go.
I love that. Like, I'm sitting here, my wheels are turning, because I'm like, this happens even like with working with patients in a myofunctional therapy setting, like adult patients, right? Like, we have so many adults who are walking around dysregulated, whether they're autistic or they're not, right? And I was a dysregulated adult. I do, have ADHD, right? But I'm like, it wasn't until, I don't know, a couple years ago that I even started to like realize how dysregulated that I was, by nature of just like looking in the mirror and working with other patients, like adult patients. And I was like, oh, so this is what dysregulation feels like. And this is what dysregulation looks like. And I am literally I'm very successful, but I am dysregulated like most of the time. And so it kind of forced me to like turn inward and figure out like how I could like help myself, and then in turn around and help my patients. Right. And like, the other thing too that I think was so fascinating about this was a lot of these dysregulated like adults walking around also just need that initial connection. They need like, that's something that like people are like, well, how do you have such success like treating patients? And I was like, well, first you need to realize the person sitting in front of you is a human, whether they're an adult or a child. Like once we can identify with the fact that this is a human in front of us and not just a goal on a piece of paper, then we start to connect in a different way. We find out what they need from us and why they're there. And we start to address that and not our conceived notions of why they're there based on the form they filled out or the intake they filled out and what we find in our evals and all that. Like it's helpful. We need that information, but also that doesn't dictate like what we do going forward. Like the person sitting in front of you is what dictates like what they're there for, what they need that day. One week is going to look different to the next. And it's true inside of like myofunctional therapy, speech therapy, feeding therapy, language therapy. I mean, I've seen it across the board myself, and I feel like nobody really teaches this or talks much about it.
Mm-hmm. When I was a clinical fellow, I started working with this autistic boy who was 3. And he wasn't talking too much. Like I remember at the time, our goal was like answering what questions, right? And his mom had a degenerative disease, and she passed away the year after this. And I just knew how much he was going through at home, and I knew that so many of these, behaviors they were seeing at school had to be so deeply rooted in how difficult it was at home. And I used to just have him come in every day to my sessions, and I would sit him on my lap. I know not all people can do that or do that. I would like sit him straight on my lap facing me, and I would just talk to him, and I would just say, how was your day? What'd you do? This is what I did today. And he wasn't talking back. He didn't have the language initially. And there was this one day, and it's like it all happens so slowly, but it's like in the blink of an eye, kids change so much. We're parents, we know the days are long, years are short kind of thing. But there was this one day, and every session I started like that because I was like, I love this kid, and I'm going to like give this kid this love, and home is so hard, and I know he needs that extra emotional connection. And there was this one day where he came in and he was crying, and his parents said he had such a hard day at school, but he's not telling us anything about what happened. And I sat him down just like I normally would, and I faced him toward me, and I was asking him about school, and he told me that they were supposed to go to the gym with their class, and he didn't want to because there was a big fan in the gym and it was so loud, and he was kicking the door and screaming. And I just remember thinking that day, like, man, I can't believe he just told me that. Like, I can't believe we got to a place where it was just me talking at him to the time when he can not only tell me what was going on during the day, but be able to identify his sensory needs on top of that and what was bothering him, and that was like a huge learning point for me as a therapist, was because I was just like, it doesn't matter sometimes the goal, because if your goal is to connect with someone, you're always going to be moving toward whatever goal that is.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I like the whole, like, if your goal is to connect with somebody, you'll move towards your goals, ultimately, your other goals. I think it's so critical. And I always say, like, what we do is a dance between an art and science. And if you only fall on the science and you just depend on like what the textbook says or what the research says, like you're going to miss the boat like 95% of the time, unfortunately.
Okay, Hallie, that is literally, I have that written in my book.
Stop it. Okay, I haven't read the book yet, guys. So tell us more.
It says it's an art and a science. And that's what I talk about. I talk about like, what is the science part of our job, and then what is the art,
Yeah.
Because the science is the part that we learn in the book, and it's the easy to follow, but the art is the thing that you're going to learn with experience. That's so funny. But, back to what you said about how so many adults are dysregulated and we don't know, or we don't know how to help ourselves. My partner, Chris, and I were just speaking, and we had this audience, a few hundred people. And this one woman said, I have this kid, he's 5, and, he can't tell me, like, when I want to understand his sensory needs, but he can't tell me what they are. And I said, there wasn't time for her question. So I was like, I'll answer this tomorrow. And then I went back to our hotel and I sat there thinking about it. And I was like, My answer is he shouldn't be able to do that. Like, we as adults
Mm,
barely know what our needs are. How are we expecting a 5-year-old who, like, how can we, are they going to say, I need a hug, I need deep squeezes, I need a walk? No, like, you are probably like me, which means I could like sit at my computer for 10 hours straight and work.
yeah.
And as much as I know I need to move, I'm not actually doing it because I'm ignoring the signals my body's sending me.
Yep.
And it's like, if we do this to ourselves and we constantly put ourselves in a state of dysregulation, how can we expect kids to do differently? So it
Yeah.
all starts with teaching them, and you have to help them figure out what their needs are. You can't just expect them to know.
That's such a great point, because I think that as adults, we way too often expect children to be like little mini adults. And when we can't, like you're saying, like when we can't even, identify or verbalize or vocalize like what it is that we need and put into words or thoughts, like what we need to do to help ourselves, why are we expecting that of children? Like,
I know.
brilliant.
Just think
I
about
mean,
like
good
being in
point.
a relationship, how much greater it would be if you actually knew what your needs were and were able to tell that person. But so often we don't know what those needs are. And then like we end up not addressing them, and then they come up as bigger issues, you
Yeah.
know?
Yep. 1000%. Yes.
And on that
So,
front, I will say once you get to know the sensory needs of the people around you, especially your significant other, you will fight about less things. I swear, this is how it is. Like, I'm
it's
like,
true.
Chris, has ADHD. He loves to move. You guys may know him as speech dude. Can't get myself to call him that. And he'll come home after a long day and he will be like, okay, do you want to go to Home Depot and then go grocery shopping? I'm like, I have like 6 episodes of Love is Blind. Can you? No, thank you. That's the last thing on my to-do list. But the thing is that our needs are so different, and I need to like calm, sit, and he needs to move. Right. But it's
Yeah.
like we put these expectations on other people that we expect what feels good to us to be the same thing that's going to feel good to them. And we're
Yeah.
just not understanding that everyone has individual differences. But once we can do that, I'm like, you go have fun, go to the store. That is so great for you and me. And I'm going
Right.
to be here doing what's
You go
regulating
do
for
our
me.
shopping. I'm going to sit
Yes.
here decompressing. Fantastic. And I think that's like such a beautiful thing, because my husband and I feel like this is actually like a work in progress, where it wasn't until I was like working with somebody, like one of my like guides, advisors, mentors, whatever you want to call her, where we were kind of diving into some of this. And as I sat back, I was like, oh, and he's kind of a private person, so I won't go into like too much detail, but he started to tell me some things about when he was like a little kid. And I was like, I think he's got a lot of sensory things going on. Okay. All right. And so then I was kind of like, how do we address this? Like, how do I change my own behaviors and actions to support that? Because I feel like things would just be so much easier for us, and like things will be more in flow, and like less arguments, like you said. And it's absolutely 100% true. Because on the days when I'm able to like tap into that, I feel like where everybody's happy and the house is just a whole different, energy and vibe. And then on the days where I'm like, I don't have the capacity to give right now in the way that like maybe he needs, even though he's not telling me he needs that, I just know he needs that. But I'm kind of like, nope, not happening right this second. I just feel like those are also the days when the house gets a little bit more chaotic. So it's a lot to put on myself. But at the same time, like to your point, if we all kind of know like how we best serve ourselves and the others in our lives, and when it comes to like our sensory systems and regulation and everything, yeah, I mean, I'm like deep in the throes of like experimenting with that in my own household. And even my 8-year-old, right? She's a kiddo. She had an absolute meltdown on Sunday. I actually was like, is she getting sick? Like, this is so out of character for her. But she's like my sensory, eater. She's become way more adventurous, like after some expansion and some work and whatever else. But she still will prefer to like fall back, on her ways. And I've noticed that that's when she's more tired, or her, it's like she doesn't have as much, she's not as regulated, right? It's much easier to fall back on like a chicken nugget or foods that don't feel like they take as much energy for her. But I've like discovered, I feel like in the past like year or so, that she's a kid who will push you away if you offer her a hug. If you're like, hey, do you need a hug? She's like, no, like, don't touch me. Ah. And if I just go up and I go, you look like you need a hug. And I kind of just like wait for her to like kind of give me that look like, yes, but I'm not going to say yes because something in my being is telling me I should say no just to be defiant. Like, it's like I just kind of go give her like a little hug and I give her a squeeze. And she kind of looks at me like, yep, that's exactly what I needed. You know, it's interesting. And like, obviously she's my own kid. And I really try to take an approach of like getting permission and not just like doing. But I also feel like she didn't know in the beginning that that's what she needed until I was, you know, giving her like some squeezy hugs. And then she was like, oh, like that feels really good. And now it's like, now we've got this kind of like, not like, you know, there's no real language between it. I can even look at her and just kind of walk up and, you know, no verbal language, I should say. And I kind of look at her and I go up and I give her a little squeeze and she kind of turns around and gives me that little like eye. And I'm like, all right, continue on, you know? And so I think it's really cool when you know, your own kids, when you can kind of tap into that. Cause I feel like that's been a big journey for me, is figuring out what she needs and like what serves her best. And it's also very interesting because she likes it. She likes it when I do it, but she doesn't want it from anybody else. It's like only for mama.
Yeah. And totally. It's just so life-changing to be able to think about that with your kids. And I know, you know, I have 4 kids. They all have completely different. They're also like, you have one kid and you're like, oh, I get this. I know how to parent. And then your next kid comes, you're like, oh, wait, this kid's actually way different. And then you're like, okay, well, now I have one of each, which means the third is going to be like one of them. And then the third is not like one of them. And then the fourth is not like any of the 3. Right. So it's like, that has been a really interesting journey for me to be on. But, you know, what you bring up is such a good point, which is, you're able to co-regulate with her, right? You're sharing your calm with her, and that is helping her to be in a state of regulation. And it also helps you as the parent, because parents get really dysregulated when our kids are dysregulated. So it's almost like it's mutual, that it's serving both of us when we are able to have those moments with our kids. And that's something I talk a lot about in my book, is how can we take this a step further? Because right now, the way a lot of people use a sensory approach and kind of the way the world is set up is this put out the fire reactive approach. Let's let the kid get dysregulated and then we'll figure out how to help them. Let's let them have a meltdown and then we'll figure out how to help them. You know, where are all the proactive strategies that we can be using? And one of the best ways to do that is you take those situations where you learn, okay, this child is dysregulated. Here's what helped them. And then you work toward that in the future, you know, and if the child's old enough, you talk to them, and you talk to them when they're regulated, you know, like the next day after something really hard happens, you talk to them and say, oh, I know yesterday was so hard and you really didn't like this. It seemed like, you know, getting a hug was really helpful. Or it seemed like when you went to the teacher and you told them you needed to take a walk was really helpful for you. I wonder if that's something that you could do in the future. And it's also, you know, as you said and had a good example of, our language can be really dysregulating for kids. And sometimes we're putting a demand on them just by asking a question, when instead, you know, Chris and I were working on at home with our kids using more declarative language, right? Like, I wonder if next time you're feeling a little overwhelmed, your teacher would let you take a walk around the school. Or what we do to our, he just turned 3. I was going to say 2-year-old, 3-year-old. I wonder which toothpaste you're going to pick out tonight.
Yes,
right? It's not go brush your teeth, time for bed.
Right. It's not which one do you want, right? It's like, I wonder which one you're going to pick.
I wonder
like,
which
you
one
have
you're gonna
choices.
pick. I bet you're going to get the strawberry, or I don't know, you're going to get the grape, right? And it's just that the way that we talk to our kids can either regulate them or dysregulate them as well.
Yeah. And I love my husband dearly, but that is like one of the major things that we're trying to work on in this house. And I'm like, just follow my lead, copy what I do. Because it's like, if I'm getting the kids ready for school, there's no screaming, there's no crying most days, you know, everybody's regulated. We send them off really great. And otherwise, if I sleep 10 minutes later and my husband goes up and wakes them up and has to get them dressed and like brush teeth and get them down, like, someone's probably yelling, someone's probably crying. And it's a different delivery of like the same information and tasks, but they just they don't respond to that. And I'm like, I always go, do they not respond to it because they know it's different when I do it? And they're like, they feel more regulated. So now they're like so hyped like up that their response is just like so overreactive when it's not, anyways, it's constantly a conversation. And quite honestly, it's something that we're working through because I'm like, I'm like, I don't expect him to change as a human per se, but I'm like, can we change our language when we're talking to the kids and how we, pose things to them, especially when they're not an option, right? It's not like you said, like, it's not, do you want to brush your teeth now or in 5 minutes? It's like, hey, I wonder which toothpaste you're going to use right now. Like, which one of those looks best?
Very
It's
second.
like,
I wonder which one.
Right now. Like, we have to go to school in 15 minutes, so let's get this done.
Yeah, it's a good point though, because it's hard to the train people, for lack of a better word. I hate to say that when we're talking husbands, but it's something we learn through practice and experience. And like what I heard Brene Brown talk about this, where she's like, my husband and I, we know that we don't have to be 100% each. I'm
Right.
could be like completely changing the way she said this, by the way. But
No,
I know
you're
on it. Make up 100% between the two of us. So if I come home and I'm only at 20%, my husband's going to make up for that 80. And I feel like that kind of thing is something Chris and I do really well together. Like when I get really overwhelmed because I'm a more sensitive person sensory wise, he's less sensitive. When I get really overwhelmed, he can come in, and I think it's a lot of just that balancing act. But honestly, it's so much harder with your own kids than it is with your clients. I'll just say that.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I feel like that's across the board. I always joked, I'm like, yeah, I mean, I was a great feeding therapist until I had my own kids. And then everything I knew went out the window. And I mean, honestly, with Lily, I wasn't working with infants at that point. But even like when we got to toddlerhood, I was like, oh, I don't remember anything. Like, this is only my specialty, but it's fine. I remember nothing. That's the point where she became really picky. Yeah, no.
Yeah,
I feel like
well,
that's so
I
true,
took
though.
your myo course, as you know, for my children, and I am now their myotherapist. So
We're
working on that.
So fun. So fun. Good luck. Yeah. Wish you all the best of luck. So they always say like doctors make the worst patients. I'm like, therapists make the worst therapists. No, I'm kidding. To their own children.
Yes.
No, we're amazing. Except for, what was hardest for me was like the consistency. And that always made me also like kind of go, I'm really glad that I was always realistic with patients, because like I'm not treating right now. So when I say was, that's why I'm using this language this way. I always like felt like, okay, what's realistic? And then also like what is it that we want them to actually do? And what is realistic? Because life. And that was even before kids, that I kind of would try and take that perspective. And I always tried to, like, any like carryover for home or anything that I would give them, I would try to build it into like what they're already doing in their schedule. So it's such a natural thing to like work on while they're driving in the car, they're brushing their teeth or whatever. And it's not like extra homework, because nobody's doing that. Let's just be honest. It's very rare that you get the amazing, person who's like, give me extra homework and we're going to sit down for 30 minutes a day and work on this. Like, no, that's not most people. So yeah, I'm like, as a therapist mom, when I then was treating my own children, I was like, oh man, this is hard. This is really hard to carve out this time.
In therapy at my clinic, like they've all been here.
Yeah, I had my team treat them. And what I ended up doing, because I was just like, yeah, I can work on some homework if I remember, but
yeah, I know. It's rough.
Yeah.
Rough life. The therapist momming.
Good times. Yes. So tell us more about this book. Like, are there other like big concepts or like anything else you want to share about it? I feel like we've kind of like, not like just by nature of chatting, we kind of hit some really cool topics.
Yeah. It's funny because for so long I said, I want to write a book, but I can't because I don't write like I'm a researcher, and I was like, I would sit down to try to write it, and I would try to write it in a way that was so formal. And this was my ex-husband, who when we were together and I was in grad school, and he was helping me with all my papers and editing them and always telling me like my writing's too casual. And, as someone who was in law school, of course, would feel that way. So I had this idea in my mind, like, I can't write a book unless it's like so formal and like textbook, ironically, I've written a chapter in a textbook, which is way different than this. But like, it wasn't fun. And I would sit
Yeah.
down and I try to write and I put it away and I go, maybe next year. And
Yeah.
I
Such a
decided,
debilitating story though, like that you had about like what it meant to
yeah.
write a book. Yeah.
And then I sat down, I was like, you know what? What would happen if I just wrote like in my voice, like the voice in my head, what it was saying, you know? And I decided I'm just going to do it. And one of the reasons was because when I would go on social media and I would write out a story, people resonated with those stories, you know? And I was like, well, if they're going to resonate with them on a post, then they'll resonate with it, the same kind of writing in a book. So I sat down, I said, I'm going to write this book. And I wrote it in like a month or like 6 weeks or something.
Stop
Because
it.
I
Oh
was
my gosh.
so motivated to write it in a way that felt authentic to me, you know? So
Yeah.
really what it ended up being, which I didn't know when I started what it would be, but what it ended up being was basically a collection of like a child I'd worked with, what I'd learned, that big concept or takeaway, and then how you can take that and implement that into your therapy, you know?
I
So like
love it.
stories about how I learned that, you know, connection was so important, and like some stories that are like so inspiring and some that are so heartbreaking, and the lessons that were learned, but then how can you take this and how can you start implementing this type of approach, you know? And
Yeah.
like how I learned why it's so important to incorporate sensory needs, and then some concepts related to that, and then how you can do it. So
I love
yeah, I'm really happy with the structure and
It's so
I'm
functional. And
excited.
I feel like people are going to eat it up because one, everyone's like, tell me what you do in therapy, like give me some strategies. And so I feel like when you share actual stories that are based on like real experiences and like kind of what shaped you as a therapist, like people are going to eat this up. I mean, this sounds amazing.
I
I'm
hope so.
excited for
I
you.
hope so. I'm excited. Yeah.
Yeah. I know I was like kind of wondering what inspired the book. And I mean, you just answered that. But it's like everyone's like, Hallie, write a book, write a book, write a book. And honestly, it's been like 3 years. And my like dentist friend and I have been writing like a children's like series. It's like very short, like 3 little mini like books. But it's just like life happens. We put it on, we table it. Like it's literally done. So at this point, it should be out. Like I don't know when, um, but everyone's like, no, write like a full on book. And I'm like, okay,
Yeah,
maybe
the
one
other
day.
thing that actually got me to is knowing that it didn't have to be like a 500-page book, you know, because the thing is, like,
Yes.
I wanted to write a book that I would like to read. And
Mm.
to me, I love nothing more than a book that's like under 200 pages. Amazing, right? I don't want to spend a year reading a book.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so just knowing that, like, it didn't have to be everything I know and every
Yeah.
single thing I've ever learned, because how could I possibly include that all in a book, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and then it just kind of like ended where it felt natural to end. I don't know. It's a weird process.
No, I mean, it's like you trust your gut and you kind of like lean into like the process and what you're doing and what feels good to you. And I'm like listening to you and I'm like taking notes in my head because everyone's like, well, if you wrote a book, what would it be on? And I can't tell you how many people have asked me that question and how many times I've said, I don't know. Like, I have no idea because it's not really been something that I've committed to. I don't know. I've always had this like inkling in my gut of like, maybe you should write a book. Maybe you should write a book. Maybe you should write a book. That feels like a natural next step. But when you tell me to do something, I'm going to do the exact opposite. Like, that's
Yeah,
just who
don't
I
write a
am by
book,
human
Hallie.
nature.
Just do not do it. Don't do it.
I always tell people, I'm like, it's like when Teresa was like, we really need a pediatric feeding course. And I was like, yeah, we do. And that sounds like a lot of work. And she was like, I mean, I could always tell somebody else to go do it. And I was like, wait, let me sleep on that. Yeah, no, I feel like there's a book in me somewhere. I'm like not sure what the topic is. So, but this is like so inspirational because at one point I was like, oh, I could probably put together a book like from some podcast episodes and like take some of the best podcasts and put that together into a book because I think that would be really cool to like pull some information together in that way. But I just never
Yeah,
did
and
it. So
someone had
here we
told me
are.
that. Someone's like, you don't even need to write if you want. You could literally just take content you've made and
Yeah.
then that's your book, you know?
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
also just nice. I feel like just being around people who are doing cool things has always been helpful for me. And our mutual friend, Jenna Castro Casvan, she's like really was probably the last, what's the positive way to say last straw? Like the last straw in a good way.
She was like the last cheerleader who was like, you need to do this.
Yeah,
Or
it was because she wrote a book. And I was like, if Jenna, who's my friend, can, like, because all these other people I know have written books, you know, it's like, oh, they're this huge researcher, this and that. And I'm like, okay, Jenna, if someone I can text and is my friend can write a book, like, I'm doing this like her.
yes.
So it's your turn. Pass the torch.
Did you use, you're passing the baton? Okay, fine. Fine. Did you use like an agency or any consultants or anything to like help you in writing and kind of guide you? I feel like that's like a big thing, and the universe keeps dropping people in my lap. So that's why I also feel like it might happen sooner than later, but who knows?
Yeah, no, I used a coach. It was the same as Jenna's. And it's just kind of funny because you ultimately do all of the writing. Like, I think sometimes you think, oh, I always thought when you used an editor, it's almost like not a ghostwriter, but like somewhere in the middle. Because I've written articles where they've come back completely like moved around and my words have been
Ash is a special
changed.
beast, so.
So like I just assumed there would be a lot more like writing from the editor, but that was definitely not my process. Like, if anything, the reason it was helpful was because I just have no idea the process. And it was just the accountability, you know. The coach I worked with, normally she would meet with someone like once a month for 6 months or twice a month for 6 months. And I was like, well, what if I met with you every week? Could we get this done quicker? And we did, you know. So accountability. But you have to, it's like are you a Tony Robbins fan?
So I don't have anything against him. I'm just not someone who's like taken his courses or like, you know, but I feel like a lot of the people who I've listened to, a lot of them came from Tony Robbins.
I'm big Tony Robbins. It's kind of embarrassing because he's like so gung-ho, you know, but he has a great quote, which is, once you have truly committed to something, the how will reveal itself. You know, so I feel like it's just one of those things where you commit to it and then it's true. Happen. Yeah. I was like I'm doing this, period. And then, you know.
Right. Well, that's the whole thing. Everyone's like, are you doing it? And I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah.
So it's like, I'm totally non-committal. So I know I think that's part of it too. Like, I know once I commit to it, I'm going to be full on like in book writing mode. And I'm like, you know, there's like other things I want to take care of. Look at you
and what you're doing every single day.
Give me a few months, guys, before I commit to this. Okay. Well, this is amazing. So where do they find your book? How do they find you? Share all the things.
ReadySetConnectBook.com is where you will find it. And we have these awesome bonuses and free trainings that we've created. So once you order the book, you will also get a bunch of bonuses, including a guidebook that you read and implement as you walk through and read the book. And yeah, I'm just really excited. I feel like this is one of those things where it's going to give you strategies to take away and just be able to implement immediately. And this is what so many therapists I've worked with through our sensory course feel. It's like you learn a concept and you go into the session and you do it, and then you are amazed that it works. You know, it's one of those things where once you focus on regulation, you will see immediate changes in your kids. It's not like something that's going to take years and years to see. It's like you come to them with the right approach, you're going to see immediate changes and progress.
So cool. So cool. I love this. And I love that you have a guide and like the bonuses. Like, that's very cool too, because, you know, for people who need like that, you know, like, let's take the concept from the book and put it on paper so I can take it and then implement it into my session. I feel like you've kind of given them that like middle piece that'll help them more easily make that connection when working with their patients. It's like, you take a class, you walk out and you're like, okay, I got 3 ideas and I know what to do with these 3 kids. And now what? You know, I feel like you're giving them like ongoing strategies that, you know, they can implement. So that's, again, like I think I said before, functional. Like, this is so functional. And that's one of the biggest things that, like, one of my biggest pet peeves, or maybe it's not a pet peeve, but complaints about so many courses out there. Not that this is a course, but I feel like I leave and it's exactly what I just said. I have an idea of like ideas of what to do with 3 kids. And then beyond that, I'm like, now what do I do? And who else can I help? And why do I feel pigeonholed into only knowing what to do with three kids? And I feel like that was such a pattern for me that I was like, that's what I want to change with like anything I put out into the world. I want to create critical thinkers. I want to give people like useful information they can go and implement now, but that they can continue to apply like in therapy and across patients. And so, and just like add to their toolbox, right? Like not everything works for everybody, but if you have enough strategies, I guess, or like, ways to approach patients, then something's going to work, right? If you kind of have at least a jumping off point. So
yes, because it truly is creating critical thinkers. And I know people don't want to hear that because that doesn't feel easy. But those are conversations we have constantly on our team, on our online course team, because that's really what it's about,
Yep. When you can move from like constantly being like, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? Help me with this patient, help me with this patient, which listen, like as, people who are experts in the field still consult with colleagues on like patient cases. So I'm not saying you're not, you need to go out and figure out what to do 100% of the time by yourself. But if you can't approach a single patient case without like having the ability to maybe try something and see what happens and then problem solve and okay, that kind of worked, but it only worked last week and it's not working today. Like, where do we go from here? And not just like shutting down and like not knowing, throwing your hands up in the air and being like, oh, I need someone else to tell me what to do. I feel like there's, we got to move beyond that to the point of, okay, I got enough tools in my tool belt. I'm going to try this. Okay, that didn't work. Then let's try that. Okay, that's not working either. Okay, now let's try this thing. Okay, it's kind of working. Okay, now that I've tried like 3 things and I'm like really struggling, let me get some mentorship, right? You know what I mean? It's like trialing it before we just kind of throw our hands up in the air when something doesn't work the first time. That's my little pet peeve, but we don't have to go there.
I just love everything you're saying. I feel like we live parallel lives, but like in different universes, like you're in the feeding Maya world and then I'm in like autism therapy and we're just, so much.
But it's like at the end of the day, like we're both dealing with humans, right? So I feel like so many of the concepts apply universally because we're not training pets. We're working with little, humans. So just saying. Amazing. And where did you share where they can find you on Instagram?
CCC-SLP. That's where I am.
Perfect. Yeah, well, everything will be in the show notes, so they'll be able to find your book and your Instagram. I know you mentioned Chris on Instagram as Speech Dude. We'll put all that in there so you guys can find Jessie and Chris wherever you need them. Jessie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Hallie. You're so amazing. I love you so much. You're such a good friend and you're so supportive and you're doing so many, like, it's just every time I talk to you, you're doing something new and you like do everything at 100%. And I'm just so happy to have you in my
guarantee you. Thank you. First of all, thank you. I received that, but I can guarantee you it's not 100%. I can promise you that. And I always tell everybody, it looks, I feel like, a lot more successful in the front end because I feel like I've got this amazing team behind me, which I know you can appreciate too, like as a business owner, but they make me look good. And like, yes, obviously I have to show up and like do certain things to like push everything forward. So I will give myself credit where credit is due.
Yes, but you're an awesome leader, but also props to your team.
Thank you. But it made me think of a quote from one of my like past mentors, Jim Fortin, where he said something along the lines of like, and I don't know if this was his quote or not, but 70% success or 70% perfection is success, 100% success or 100% perfection is failure. Mm-hmm. And like when I sat and listened to that, I was like, oof, because at the time I was such a type A personality that I was like, no, that not receiving that. And now like years later, I'm like, yeah, I wish I learned that lesson way earlier on.
Done is better than perfect.
Yes. It's funny. I was thinking of like podcast topics for my other podcast today, and that I wrote that down. Done is better than perfect. I actually wrote those words down. We are living parallel lives, Jessie. What is going on here? I love it. Well, thank you again for joining me. This has been so fun.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. If you found value in this episode and want to hear more of these myotots, airway, and feeding related episodes, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts and share this episode on your social media platforms. You can access free resources and all I offer at halliebalkin.com or pop over to @HallieBalkin on Instagram to get all the latest updates.